You're listening to Audiology. Support this channel by becoming a member and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. In 1830, a group of Native American nations known as the 5 Civilized Tribes, which includes the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, Muskogee, and Seminole, were living on their own lands in what is now called the American Deep South. They were in the midst of adopting certain lifestyles similar to those of white Americans, a change initially suggested by George Washington and Henry Knox. This was particularly true for the Cherokee and Choctaw communities. At this time, American settlers were pushing the government to move these Indian nations out of the Southeast. Many settlers had already started moving onto their lands, while others simply wanted more land available for settling. Despite opposition from figures like U.S. Congressman Davy Crockett of Tennessee, President Andrew Jackson succeeded in getting Congress to pass the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This law allowed the government to take over any land owned by these Native American nations in the Southeast. The Choctaw Nation was the first to be forcibly relocated in 1831, setting a precedent for how the other tribes would be moved. After 2 conflicts, many Seminoles were removed in 1832, followed by the Creek in 1834, the Chickasaw in 1837, and finally the Cherokee in 1838. Despite these removals, some members of these tribes managed to stay behind in their ancestral lands, including some Choctaw in Mississippi, Creek in Alabama and Florida, Cherokee in North Carolina, and Seminole in Florida. A small group of less than 500 Seminole successfully avoided removal altogether. Today's Seminole Nation of Florida descends from these survivors. Moreover, during the westward journey, the tribes were accompanied by over 4,000 slaves and other people of African descent, such as spouses or freedmen. By 1837, some 46,000 Native Americans from these southeastern states had been moved, making 25 million acres available for white settlers. When the 5 tribes reached what was known as Indian Territory, they not only took over lands that belonged to other tribes like the Plains Indians, but also tried to erase these tribes' histories. They aimed to show that they were entering an undeveloped wilderness, participating in the same settler colonialism process and appealing to white American sensibilities. Other tribes already living in the Indian Territory, such as the Quapaws and Osages, viewed the 5 tribes as intruders on their land. Before 1838, the boundaries of Native American nations, which covered large areas of what is now the United States, constantly changed. This was due in part to the pressures from settlers and threats of military action in areas the United States had claimed. As these areas turned into United States states, state governments tried to dissolve the independence of these native nations and take over their lands. This situation was made worse by the growing number of people moving into the United States and the expansion of slavery, especially with the boom in cotton farming after Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. Many from the southeastern native nations were deeply involved in the area's economy, even participating in the plantation system and owning slaves, who were also forced to move during relocations. The idea of removing Native Americans wasn't new with President Andrew Jackson, despite the common association with him and the Trail of Tears. Historian Jeffrey Osler has pointed out that scholars have debunked the myth of the vanishing Indian, which suggested the decline of native populations was natural and unavoidable, letting Americans ignore the harm their actions caused. Osler also notes that Jackson didn't start the idea of removal, describing it instead as the completion of a policy nearly 30 years in the making. Hannah James Fenimore Cooper's asterisk. The Last of the Mohicans asterisk played a big part in promoting this myth by depicting the last of the noble and pure Native Americans as naturally dying out, leaving the continent to a settler, suggesting an inevitable handover of the land. This story helped shape the foundational myths of the United States, as noted by Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz, perpetuating the exclusion of Native Americans from the narrative of American society and culture, as criticized by historian Francis Jennings. Andrew Jackson wasn't the first to think of the policy of removing Native Americans from their lands, but he played a significant role in the execution of that plan. Jackson's push to relocate the Native Americans began well before he assumed the presidency. Once in office, the implementation of this idea became his main objective. He even proclaimed in his initial address to Congress that the relocation of the Native Americans should be voluntary. Nonetheless, he made it clear that if they opted to remain, they were obligated to comply with state legislation. He was of the belief that such an exchange would safeguard their rights to the territories they had established as their own through diligence. Jackson's belligerent history and his dedication to the relocation of Native Americans caused considerable unease across many U.S. territories. During his presidency, the United States negotiated a significant number of treaties, 86 in total, with various Native American nations culminating in their cession of land. Jackson contended that relocating Native Americans away from European American settlements was in their best interest, offering them the opportunity to maintain their way of life, free from the jurisdiction of state governments. This concept was codified with the enactment of the Indian Removal Act in 1830, which Jackson persuaded Congress to ratify. This legislation authorized him to exchange lands with Native Americans and facilitate their migration westward, contingent upon their consent. Martin Van Buren, Jackson's successor, acknowledged him as the catalyst behind this legislation. Historian Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz posits that Jackson perceived violence as a mechanism to further U.S. territorial expansion, viewing Native Americans as obstacles to this ambition. Another historian, Amy H. Sturgis, highlights Jackson's reputation for adopting a stringent stance towards Native Americans, prioritizing the utility of their fear over their alliance. Despite the statute's provision for voluntary migration, Jackson regarded the presence of Native Americans as an impediment to the development of states such as Mississippi and Alabama. Critics, including prominent figures and reformers, opposed Jackson's removal strategy. Nevertheless, some scholars contend that Jackson has been subjected to overly harsh judgment. Francis Paul Prucha asserts that Jackson had the well-being of the country and all its citizens at heart, striving to safeguard them. Robert V. Rimini also defends Jackson's actions, arguing that they were intended to prevent the extinction of the 5 civilized tribes, rather than inflict harm. In conclusion, Jackson's involvement in the displacement of Native Americans from their natal territories is intricate and continues to be a topic of contention among historians, with interpretations of his motives ranging from protective to aggressively expansionist. President Jackson pushed forward with the Indian removal policy, and on December 29, 1835, the Treaty of New Echota was signed, which essentially gave the Cherokee people 2 years to relocate to what is now Oklahoma. While the Chickasaws and Choctaws had agreed to similar treaties with the U.S. government, and the Creeks were pressured into agreeing, the Treaty of New Echota was particularly controversial. It was signed by a minority group within the Cherokee Nation known as the Treaty Party, led by Elias Boudinot, but it did not have the approval of the majority of the Cherokee people, the Cherokee National Council, or Principal Chief John Ross. Despite the Cherokee National Council sending a petition to Congress signed by thousands of Cherokee citizens asking for the treaty to be nullified in February 1836, the Senate went ahead and ratified it in March 1836. This treaty laid the groundwork for what became known as the Trail of Tears, a forced relocation that only a small number chose willingly. With the involvement of state militias, the U.S. government moved most of the remaining Cherokee in 1838. They were held in camps in eastern Tennessee before being divided into groups of about 1,000 each for the journey west during harsh winter conditions. Under the Treaty of New Echota, the Cherokee were promised land in what is now Oklahoma and $5 million from the federal government in exchange for all their lands east of the Mississippi River. This decision was deeply unpopular within the Cherokee community, leading over 16,000 Cherokees to sign a petition against the treaty's passage. By 1840, tens of thousands of individuals from the Cherokee and other Native American nations had been forced from their ancestral lands east of the Mississippi. The Indian Removal Act of 1830 facilitated the relocation of the Creek, Choctaw, Seminole, and Chickasaw as well. The removal was so harrowing that one Choctaw leader described it as a trail of tears and deaths, highlighting the profound suffering and loss of life that marked the displacement of the native population from the southeastern United States. The creation of Indian Territory and the cessation of Indian land claims to the east of the Mississippi River through the Indian Removal Act set the stage for the subsequent introduction of the U.S. Indian Reservation System applied to the remaining Indian lands in the 19th century. The idea that Indian nations possessed their own sovereignty persisted until the Supreme Court's Cherokee Nation v. Georgia decision in 1831, which determined the Cherokee were not a sovereign independent nation and could not seek a hearing in court. Following the Indian Removal Act, the Cherokee brought several lawsuits against the actions of Georgia, with the most notable case being Worcester v. Georgia in 1832. This case involved Samuel Worcester and others who were jailed by Georgia for residing in Cherokee territory without authorization, challenging their imprisonment as it contravened treaties between Indian nations and the U.S. government. The Supreme Court sided with Worcester, affirming that Cherokee laws were only subject to federal law and that Georgia had no authority over Cherokee land. Although the court ruled in favor of Worcester, there was no mandate for President Andrew Jackson to enforce this decision. Jackson avoided enforcing the ruling to avert potential conflict with Georgia that could escalate into a civil war, instead prioritizing the negotiation of a land exchange treaty with the Cherokee. His political adversaries, Henry Clay and John Quincy Adams, along with Ralph Waldo Emerson, a writer and activist who lauded the Cherokees' efforts to assimilate into American culture, denounced Jackson for not upholding the Cherokees' rights against Georgia. During that era, members of Indian nations were not recognized as U.S. citizens. Despite citizenship tests for Indians in annexed regions, individual states did not recognize Indian nations' claims to land and made distinctions in rights between white and non-white citizens who had restricted legal standing. The expulsion of Indians was enforced by the U.S. military or state militias, frequently displacing Indians who had acquired U.S. citizenship from their lands. The Choctaw Nation once occupied large areas of what we now know as Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana. Starting in 1801, a series of treaties dramatically shrunk their lands to 11 million acres. The Treaty of Dancing Rabbit Creek, ratified in early 1831, gave their last remaining lands to the United States, but allowed some Choctaws a choice to stay. This treaty marked the first time the federal government offered such an agreement, surprising even President Andrew Jackson with the Choctaws' willingness to negotiate. The agreement also promised that the U.S. would cover the relocation costs and that the Choctaws had 2.5 years to move. Before the removal began, Choctaw Chief George W. Harkins penned a letter to the American people, expressing both his reluctance and resolve. He wrote about choosing freedom and suffering over living under oppressive laws they had no hand in creating. The relocation, overseen by United States Secretary of War appointee George Gaines, occurred in 3 stages between November 1831 and 1833. Initially, the Choctaws faced brutal winter conditions with flash floods, sleet, and snow, complicating their journey. Originally intended to travel by wagon, they were instead moved by steamboat due to the floods, facing severe food shortages along the way. The challenging conditions led one Choctaw chief to call their experience a trail of tears and death after arriving in Little Rock, having battled below freezing temperatures and food rationing. French philosopher Alexis de Tocqueville witnessed these removals and noted the despair and irrevocable loss, highlighting the stoic sadness of the Choctaws who simply sought freedom. Nearly 17,000 Choctaws relocated to what would later become Oklahoma, with an estimated 2,500 to 6,000 dying along the way. About 5,000 to 6,000 chose to stay in Mississippi, facing legal battles, harassment, and violence, leading some of their leaders to die due to such treatments. These remaining Choctaws eventually formed the Mississippi Band of Choctaw Indians, while the ones who moved became known as the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Back in the day, the United States acquired Florida from Spain through a deal known as the Adams-Onis Treaty, and by 1821, it was officially part of the United States. Fast forward to 1832, and the Seminoles were summoned to Payne's Landing on the Ocklawaha River. And here they faced a tough choice under the Treaty of Payne's Landing: move west if the new land seemed okay. This move meant living on land with the Creek Nation, who weren't exactly welcoming the Seminoles with open arms, because some Seminoles were originally from Creek groups or other indigenous nations, and there was bad blood between them. In a reluctant journey that didn't start until October 1832, 7 Seminole chiefs went to check out this new land. After several months in discussions with the Creeks who were already living there, on March 28, 1833, these chiefs somewhat agreed the land was all right. But when they got back to Florida, things got complicated. Most of the chiefs claimed they either didn't sign the agreement, were forced to, or said they simply didn't have the right to make such a big decision for everyone. However, the Seminole villages near the Apalachicola River decided to move in 1834. The situation escalated on December 28, 1835, when Seminoles, alongside black allies, ambushed a U.S. Army company, almost wiping them out in what's known as the Dade Massacre. This event was a clear sign that the Seminoles weren't going to relocate without a fight, leading Florida to brace for war. The St. Augustine militia called for weapons, and over 500 volunteers stepped up under Brigadier General Richard K. Call. Indian war parties, raids, and the destruction of property followed, forcing families to seek safety. Osceola, a notable leader, and others like Halleck Tustanuggee, Jumper, and Black Seminoles, Abraham and John Horse didn't go down without a fight. The conflict dragged on for a decade, ending in 1842 and costing the United States about $20 million at the time, equivalent to over $631 million today. Many Seminoles were forced out west, but some managed to escape to the Everglades. Ultimately, the United States government stopped trying to conquer the Seminole in the Everglades, leaving less than 500 in peace. Despite this, many believe several hundred Seminoles stayed hidden in the Everglades after the wars. As a testament to their resilience, the Seminole Band in the Everglades is recognized as the only indigenous nation that never gave up sovereignty or agreed to a peace treaty with the United States. Yet, at the time, many Americans, influenced by reports like the one from the Virginia Inquirer on January 26, 1836, saw the Seminole resistance as unjustified, accusing them of not sticking to their agreements under the Indian Removal Act. After the War of 1812, leaders from the Muskogee or Creek Nation like William McIntosh and Chief Shalakta agreed to treaties that handed over more land to the state of Georgia. A pivotal moment came in 1814, with the Treaty of Fort Jackson essentially ending the Creek Nation's autonomy and marking a turning point for indigenous peoples in the South. Despite friendly Creeks reminding Andrew Jackson, whom they called Sharp Knife, of their peaceful stance, Jackson accused them of not eliminating Tecumseh, a Shawnee leader, when they had the chance, demanding instead that they surrender Creek lands. He overlooked an article in the Treaty of Ghent which was supposed to restore sovereignty to Native American nations. In the first peace talks, Jackson briefly acknowledged the help from the friendly Creeks, but quickly criticized the Red Sticks, a Creek faction, for their alliances, insisting the whole nation should compensate for the U.S. war efforts by ceding 23 million acres of land. The Creek Confederacy later made it a capital offense to give away any more land, but on February 12, 1825, McIntosh and other leaders signed the Treaty of Indian Springs, relinquishing most of the Creek lands left in Georgia. McIntosh was killed by fellow Creeks for this on April 30, 1825, after the U.S. Senate ratified the treaty. The Creek National Council under Opothol Yohola contested the treaty's legitimacy to the U.S. government. President John Quincy Adams sided with them, leading to the nullification of the treaty through the Treaty of Washington in 1826, a rare achievement noted by historian R. Douglas Hurt. Despite this, Georgia's Governor George Troup ignored the new treaty, proceeding with forced removals. Adams considered military intervention but decided against it to avoid civil conflict, expressing that the conflict over Native American rights wasn't worth war. By this time, many Creeks had been removed to what is now Oklahoma, but about 20,000 remained in Alabama. The state attempted to dissolve Creek governance and impose state laws, prompting Opothol Yohola to seek protection from President Andrew Jackson, which wasn't provided. The Treaty of Cusseta was signed on March 24, 1832, breaking up Creek lands for individual sale or settlement. However, this treaty's terms weren't honored, leading to rampant illegal settlements and fraud against the Creeks. Resentment among the Creeks grew, occasionally erupting into violence. This tension led to the Creek War of 1836, following an attack on Roanoke, Georgia. The U.S. responded with military force, culminating in the removal of over 15,000 Creeks to Indian Territory under difficult conditions, resulting in the deaths of 3,500 people during the relocation. This tragic episode was part of a broader policy of Indian removal, enacted in the 1830s, which displaced numerous indigenous peoples from their ancestral lands. The Chickasaw Nation received money from the United States for their lands on the east side of the Mississippi River. Back in 1836, after 5 long years of tough discussions, the Chickasaws made a deal to buy land from the Choctaws, who had already been moved from their lands. They agreed to pay $530,000, which is like having $14.7 million today, for the western part of the Choctaw Territory. The first group of Chickasaws, led by John M. Millard, started their journey in 1837. They all met up in Memphis on July 4, 1837, bringing everything they owned, their personal belongings, animals, and slaves. After crossing the Mississippi River, they used the paths that the Choctaws and Creeks had taken before them. Once they arrived in what was known as Indian Territory, the Chickasaws combined with the Choctaw Nation, becoming part of their community. By the year 1838, around 2,000 Cherokees had chosen to move from Georgia to what is now called Oklahoma. However, forced removals started in May of that year when General Winfield Scott, acting on orders from President Martin Van Buren, began moving the remaining Cherokee population. Sadly, about 4,000 Cherokees passed away on their journey to Oklahoma, a tragic event that the Cherokee referred to as Nu Nada Ultsun Yi, meaning the place where they cried, or Nuna Hiduna Tlohi Lui, the trail where they cried. This heartbreaking journey, known as the Cherokee Trail of Tears, happened because of the Treaty of New Echota. This treaty was part of the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which traded Cherokee land in the east for territories west of the Mississippi River. Unfortunately, this treaty was not approved by the Cherokee's elected leaders or the majority of its people. During this period, significant shifts in gender roles occurred within the Cherokee Nation. Traditionally, the Cherokee society was matrilineal, meaning that lineage was traced through the mother, and children became members of their mother's clan. Families lived matrilocally, meaning that after marriage, a man would live with his wife's family. As documented by the naturalist William Bartram, Cherokee marriages did not impact the independence of a wife's property rights, and in cases of separation, the wife retained possession of both the children and property. Yet in the 1820s and 1830s, Cherokee society began to adopt the Anglo-American style of patriarchy, prioritizing the political and social power of wealthy, culturally assimilated men and diminishing the societal standing of women. Interestingly, when it came to the Treaty of New Echota, its negotiation mainly involved men, sidelining Cherokee women from the discussion, despite their historical involvement in council decisions and land negotiations, such as their noteworthy participation in the 1785 Treaty Conference in Hopewell, South Carolina. As historian Theda Perdue notes, even though Cherokee women continued to hold their own councils and share their views, they were excluded from directly participating in the treaty's negotiation. This marks a stark shift in the role and influence of women within the Cherokee Nation, showcasing the profound impact of colonial pressures on their societal structure. Georgia's farmers, feeling the pressure of a growing population, had their sights set on the scarcely populated Cherokee lands, leading to unauthorized settlements. The situation intensified with the discovery of gold near Dahlonega, Georgia, in 1829, initiating the state's gold rush, the second one in United States history. This discovery led to hopeful prospectors trespassing on Cherokee territory without consent, heightening the urgency to fulfill an earlier agreement, the Compact of 1802, where the U.S. government had promised to take over Indian lands in Georgia for the state. In 1830, Georgia attempted to enforce its laws on Cherokee lands, culminating in a pivotal legal battle in the U.S. Supreme Court. The case, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia, in 1831 ended with the court denying the Cherokee Nation's sovereignty, thus refusing to hear the case. However, the following year brought a turning point with the Worcester versus Georgia decision, clarifying that Georgia could not enforce its laws on Cherokee territory, as only the federal government possessed the authority to handle Native American affairs. This case is notably associated with President Andrew Jackson's alleged yet untrue statement, "John Marshall has made his decision. Now let him enforce it." This statement, however, was only brought to light 30 years later, and first documented in a book by Horace Greeley, a critic of Jackson. Andrew Jackson, aiming to avoid conflict between the Georgia militia and federal troops, and already embroiled in a disagreement with South Carolina, opted not to back the Cherokees' resistance against Georgia. Instead, preferring their relocation to prevent an outright civil war, He relied on the Indian Removal Act of 1830, which bestowed upon him the authority to negotiate treaties for relocating Native Americans west of the Mississippi River. This scenario provided the basis for pressuring the Cherokee into signing a treaty for their displacement. This relocation treaty, passed in Congress by a margin of just one vote and signed by President Jackson, was enacted by his successor, President Martin Van Buren. Van Buren authorized a significant armed force to relocate about 13,000 Cherokees to Cleveland, Tennessee. This operation, commanded by General Winfield Scott, was subsequently followed by their forced migration to Oklahoma under the supervision of the U.S. military. The Cherokee lands were swiftly made available for settlement. Regrettably, the journey led to numerous deaths among the Cherokee, primarily due to disease, malnutrition, and the severe conditions of an unusually cold winter. Back in the winter of 1838, the Cherokee embarked on a grueling 1,000-mile journey. Starting in Red Clay, Tennessee, the last eastern capital of their nation, they had very little to protect them from the cold, many walking barefoot or without proper shoes. Their path didn't allow them to enter any towns or villages due to disease fears, forcing them to take longer detours. By early December 1838, they reached the Ohio River opposite Golconda in southern Illinois, starving and in desperate need of crossing. They were met with extortion at Berry's Ferry, being charged an exorbitant fee of $1 each, significantly more than the usual 12 cents. They could only cross after everyone else had been served, leaving them to wait under the shelter of Mantle Rock, where many died from the cold and starvation. Tragically, several Cherokee were even murdered by locals, leading the Cherokee to later sue the U.S. government for compensation. Continuing their journey, the Cherokee faced extreme cold in southern Illinois. Martin Davis, a commissary agent, described the harsh conditions: frozen rivers, frequent snow, and slow progress. They were trapped near the Mississippi River swamp, unable to cross due to the ice, having moved only 65 miles in a month. A volunteer soldier from Georgia, reflecting on his experiences, said that despite battling in the Civil War, witnessing the Cherokee removal was the cruelest work he'd ever seen, underscoring the brutality of the forced march. The stretch through southern Illinois proved to be the deadliest. While some Cherokee had previously chosen a water route for relocation, taking just 21 days, the forced journey on foot, avoiding water travel due to distrust, was far more perilous and costly in human lives. David Gaines and Jerry Krakow, environmental researchers, explain the tragic Cherokee relocation within a backdrop of differing attitudes towards land. American Indians held a deep regard for the land, whereas Euro-Americans viewed it as property to be owned. This clash, as noted by sociologists Gregory Hooks and Chad L. Smith, led to the United States government giving away and selling American Indian lands to support Western expansion, allowing railroad developers, white settlers, and others to take ownership. Dina Gilio-Whitaker, a scholar from the Colville tribe, highlights how this led to American Indians losing their ancient connections to homelands and sacred sites, experiencing death rates of up to 25% among those relocated, and losing essential livestock and crops. Dina Gilio-Whitaker draws upon the research of Choctaw and Chippewa historian Clara Sue Kidwell to link the Trail of Tears to environmental damage. Despite initially adopting European customs, including a cash-based economy and even practicing slavery, the southeastern tribes found their circumstances drastically altered by the relocation. They encountered coal deposits and were engulfed by the expansion of the Western Railway, leading to a deeper integration into the American economic system. Cherokee ethnobotanist Clint Carroll discusses how these changes affected Cherokee efforts to protect traditional medicinal plants, shifting land management from a relationship-based to a resource-based approach. This change, driven by federal policies, has had negative environmental impacts and, in severe cases, has led to human rights abuses. Beyond the physical relocation, the Trail of Tears triggered profound social and cultural shifts for American Indians, forcing them to leave their native lands, a concept unthinkable to the Cherokees, for whom every aspect of the land holds a spiritual significance and is central to their identity and way of life. Gilio-Whitaker describes this as environmental deprivation, where actions by settlers and their governments aim to cut off native peoples' access to vital and culturally significant resources. Rachel Robeson Green, a scholar, points out that this led to the loss of indigenous knowledge and perspectives, especially in scientific domains and governance, where European colonial powers sought to exploit indigenous resources. This loss extends to indigenous contributions to environmental sustainability, underscoring the cultural and intellectual erasure caused by indigenous removal and the Trail of Tears. When the Cherokees were removed and relocated near Tahlequah, Oklahoma, it was a momentous and tragic period. Major Ridge, a key figure in signing the 1835 Treaty of New Echota, famously stated, "I have signed my death warrant." This treaty led to significant political unrest, resulting in the deaths of prominent leaders Major Ridge, John Ridge, and Elias Boudinot, with Standwatie being the only leader of the treaty party to survive. Despite these dark times, the Cherokee Nation managed to recover, growing to become the largest American Indian group in the United States today. A notable fact is that not all Cherokees were removed. Around 100 managed to avoid U.S. soldiers, making their homes in the wilderness of Georgia and other states. There were exceptions for Cherokees living on privately owned lands, who were spared from removal. In North Carolina, approximately 400 Cherokees, known as the Oconaluftee Cherokee, found refuge on land owned by William Holland Thomas, a white man adopted by the Cherokees when he was young. This area, along with another group from the Nantahala region who were allowed to stay on the Qualla boundary for assisting the U.S. Army, became home to the eastern band of the Cherokee Nation. Interestingly, local perceptions during this period were mixed. For instance, the Highland Messenger in 1840 highlighted the frustration of local citizens in North Carolina who wished to acquire land, believing the Cherokee had been completely removed. They described the remaining Cherokee as a nuisance, yet reported that President Martin Van Buren viewed the Cherokee as free to go or stay. The Cherokees' resistance to their displacement and suffering was often voiced through powerful speeches by significant figures like Elias Boudinot, Major Ridge, Speckled Snake, John Ross, and Richard Taylor. These orators played a vital role in rallying the Cherokee people, emphasizing unity and resistance. Chief John Ross and Major Ridge in particular toured the Cherokee Nation to inspire collective resolve, with Ross emphasizing the importance of unity and safeguarding their rights. Another form of resistance was through the written word. John Ridge, son of Major Ridge, wrote passionately against the injustices faced by the Cherokee under the pseudonym Socrates in the Cherokee Phoenix newspaper. His articles aimed to enlighten readers about the hypocrisy of the U.S. government and colonial history, drawing on various historical and literary sources to argue for the respect of Cherokee rights. On May 18, 1905, the United States Court of Claims decided in favor of the Eastern Cherokee Nation in a dispute against the U.S. government. This decision led to the allocation of $1 million to the nation, a sum that would be equivalent to about $27.4 million today. To ensure the fair distribution of these funds to the eligible members and their families of the Eastern Cherokee Nation, an employee from the Interior Department, Guion Miller, was tasked with creating a comprehensive list. This list, known as the Guion Miller Roll, was compiled from various rolls and applications to accurately verify who belonged to the tribe. The process attracted applications documenting over 125,000 individuals claiming to be part of the Eastern Cherokee Nation. After careful review, the court gave the green light for more than 30,000 of these individuals to receive a share of the funds. This effort was significant in terms of acknowledging the claims of the Eastern Cherokee Nation and providing restitution based on those claims. The events we're talking about are often referred to as death marches, especially when discussing the Cherokee journey through Tennessee, Kentucky, and Missouri in 1838. Some Indians who could afford it took care of their own relocation. There were groups led by U.S. Army conductors, including Edward Diaz, who was perceived as someone who empathized with the Cherokee and their challenging situation. The highest number of deaths occurred after the deadline of May 23, 1838. That's when the remaining Cherokee were gathered into camps and put into large groups, some with over 700 people. Being so close together made it easier for diseases to spread, leading to many deaths. These groups were among the last to leave, following the same paths as those before them, which had been stripped of supplies due to the large numbers that had already passed through. Along the way, these groups encountered threats, extortion, and violence. Additionally, they had to travel during the worst weather conditions, both the hottest and coldest times of the year, leading to even more deaths. The exposure to harsh weather conditions, diseases, Lack of food, attacks from local people, and insufficient supplies resulted in the death of up to 1/3 of the Choctaw and members of other nations on the march. There is some debate among historians and the nations involved regarding the use of the term Trail of Tears. Some question whether it should refer to the entire history of forced relocations from the eastern United States to Indian Territory, just the relocations of the 5 civilized tribes, the physical routes of the marches, or only specific ones where the last resisting members from each area were forced to leave. The Trail of Tears is a subject that sparks much debate among historians, with some viewing it as a form of ethnic cleansing and others labeling it as genocide. Robert V. Ramini, a historian and biographer, suggests that President Andrew Jackson had positive intentions with his policy toward Native Americans. Ramini explains that Jackson believed relocating the Native Americans would ultimately benefit them, allowing them to thrive and integrate into United States society. However, not all historians are in agreement on Jackson's motivations or the outcomes of his policies. Sean Wilentz points out that some critics consider the Indian removal as genocide, arguing it represents a significant shift in American history that some perceive in overly simplistic or dramatic terms. Donald B. Cole acknowledges the challenge in proving a deliberate genocidal intent in Jackson's actions, but questions the idea that Jackson was primarily concerned with Native American welfare. Daniel Blake Smith is another person who challenges the labeling of these events as genocide, stating that there was no intention for the Cherokees to die during their forced relocation. Justin D. Murphy argues that while the Trail of Tears was undeniably tragic, it doesn't quite meet the criteria of genocide, especially since tribes were somewhat allowed to retain their identity. Conversely, Jeffrey Osler believes that the policy had genocidal elements, both in its outcomes and the methods used to enforce compliance. Patrick Wolfe discusses the connection between settler colonialism and genocide, suggesting that the latter encompasses but is not limited to the actual killing of indigenous peoples. According to Wolfe, the assimilation and displacement actions also constituted cultural genocide. Roxanne Dunbar Ortiz characterizes the U.S. government's treatment of Native peoples as genocidal, asserting that Jackson's policies were a continuation of previously established aggressive expansion tactics. Similarly, Dina Gilio-Whitaker describes the Trail of Tears in the Dine Long Walk as structural genocide, highlighting the destruction of Native peoples' connections to their land, each other, and the environment, actions she views as both cultural and physical genocide with enduring impacts. Thanks for watching. Share your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more content.